Welcome back to GDEX TV. I think so far successful day.
So far, I mean, I think we could still screw it up.
Oh yeah, we still got a few hours. We can
Yeah.
totally
Yeah.
mess this up.
So I'll set my timer and stopwatch.
Yeah. So we're about to pull in Constance, who's going to talk about Tilt and Esports, a topic I'm very excited about.
Me too, honestly.
Hey, Constance.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How about you?
Yeah, we're doing good. Thank you for being a part of GDEX this year.
Happy to be here.
So before we go to your talk, would you like to tell a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Constance Steinkuehler. I'm faculty at UCI. Before being here in California, we were at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've spent probably 15, 20 years studying gamers, everything from the intellectual work they do to socialization, etc. So a lot of our current work focuses on esports and more competitive play. So today I want to talk a little bit about Tilt as sort of a sub-construct under sort of what's happening in game communities around toxicity and disruptive player behavior.
Awesome. Well, the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Is it okay for me to share slides?
Yes, please.
Good. All right, I'm going to share my slides. One moment.
What? I got two people asking me a question. I'm sorry.
You're good.
What?
That's
It
weird.
does not want to.
We're having slide issues.
Yeah, it doesn't want to let me share slides.
Oh no.
Are you able to do it on your end?
If you go down to present now, is that not working for you?
No, that's what I'm using. So when I say present a window, choose Microsoft PowerPoint, I get an error message that says Google Chrome might not have permission to use screen recording on your computer. Oh, maybe not the system preferences. Give me 1 minute.
Let's do it. Let's system preference.
Let's just do this right now. System preference this.
Whew, what did I do?
The only way to do that is for me to quit and come back.
Okay, we can do that.
Yeah.
All right,
We're here all day.
The real magic of GDEX. Whoa!
She broke the mainframe!
Oh, this is.
Well, I guess we just saw into reality
I
today.
wish you guys dancing there.
Oh wait, can we?
Oh.
Oh,
we're
it's
back.
gone.
That was awesome.
How's your speed?
Welcome back.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
You will not be held down by technology. Okay, can you see my slides?
We can.
Oh, I'm so glad. All right, so let me just go through a little bit. First, so this is a study that I did with some of the researchers in my lab. Our lab is lab number 5013. We're at University of California, Irvine. And we really, everyone in our lab really looks at, collaborative and competitive gameplay. So we're doing a lot of work around esports. And part of our work, at least today, we're going to focus on these data were taken out of Youth Esports program, a program called NASEF, the North America Scholastic Esports Federation. They're funded by the Samueli Foundation. And one of the reasons we're very interested in them is that it's sort of this enriched model of esports for youth. It's one of the only sort of school-sanctioned, school-affiliated programs with a curriculum in schools as well. But today we're just going to talk about young players and a study that we did around Tilt itself. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Tilt. I'm going to presume most people in the audience are very familiar with the term, but may not always know its origins. Tilt really comes out of pinball. Obviously, if you're my age, you remember the pinball machines that if you were to play them too hard or actually tilt the machine, it would spaz out and you'd get these big tilt error messages. But it was picked up then by poker, really as a way to reference what happens when a player becomes emotional and starts making poor decisions in their gameplay. And from poker, it was borrowed into esports. And this is an image from Riot Games. Anyone who's been in this sort of competitive space, but even way beyond esports in terms of even amateur professional, this notion of tilt, what happens with tilt, I think most of us have experienced it either on a personal way, as in we've tilted, or been sort of an innocent bystander to tilt and been on the receiving end of what happens when tilt goes into play. But for professional teams, it's really vital trying to figure out how to deal with tilt because it leads to such poor player behavior. I'm really interested in it because tilt is one of the sources, certainly not the only or not necessarily the most important, but it's one of the contributors to some of the disruptive player behavior that we see online. So we really came into this as a much more exploratory research project, and we had some very basic questions about tilt, trying to understand how do players define tilt, what triggers it, what do they do to respond to it, and then whether or not they view tilt as malleable. So this was a study that we ran. Oh, I should also say there were two hypotheses. We presumed that different triggers for tilt may lead to different tilt responses, and also that whether or not you think tilt is malleable might shape how you respond to tilt. So if you think about in the education world, we talk a lot about DUEX work and this notion of a growth mentality versus a fixed mentality, and it turns out to be a really strong correlate for school success and life success. So we were thinking about tilt in the same ways, thinking about, does your belief of whether or not you can control tilt or change your own, let's say, tilt ability, how does that shape your tilt responses? All right, so those were our questions and our two hypotheses going in. The study design is pretty straightforward. We used NACEP because we wanted to look especially at younger players. So all of our sample is from after-school program. In this case, it's league competitors. They play League of Legends, Overwatch, in this season that we studied them in spring. Our sample was an N of 103. That was 95 student players, all between the ages of 14 and 18, and 8 staffers. Now, when COVID struck in March, we had to stop all research at the university. So we had to stop drawing our sample there. So that's a little bit smaller than what we were aiming for originally, about half of what we were aiming for, but there was no way around that. On the survey, it was a very simple open response survey. So we simply asked straightforward, what words do you associate with tilt? What gets you tilted? When you feel tilted, what do you do? And do you think you can change how easily you're tilted? So all of them were open response. Most participants gave us maybe 3 to 8 word responses. And then that last one was closed response item, just yes, no, or I don't know. On the interview side, we had 8 staffers. Now, the staffers were treated differently. We really used that data set. We interviewed the coaches and the GMs that were working with youth in order to sort of verify some of the patterns that we saw in the student report data. And for analysis, we just did inductive coding. Because the answers were fairly short, it was pretty straightforward. We had 3 researchers that coded it independently, and we actually negotiated, because this was exploratory, we went ahead and negotiated any discrepancies, all of them, so that all coders were in agreement by the end of it. So what do we find? On the first one, tilt definition, pretty much what we expected. You see both the emotional component of tilt, feelings of anger, frustration, toxicity, but also that behavioral component that, again, we associate from poker and now esports of clouded judgment, confusion, etc. When we looked at tilt triggers, we started getting some a little bit more interesting picture here. So, one of the things, let me pull out my laser pointer. It's a Friday. We need a laser pointer involved. Can you guys still hear me okay? Oh, perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so please interrupt if please interrupt me if anything goes awry. I can only see my own slides. But so on the tilt triggers, what we found was that overwhelmingly, the biggest trigger was not opponents. Opponents was only 2%. The biggest triggers for tilt were actually teammates. So your collaborative team. Now, this other category, which was second, that was cases in which people essentially are saying other people, but did not specify whether it was your teammates or your opponents. So that was a separate category we kept. That was, since it was more vague, we kept it separate. The third biggest one was actually yourself. So, you know, 19% of the time, people report that their own performance is the source of their trigger. And of course, you know, the fifth in place is loss, which again, you know, whether or not, presumably that's some admixture of game plus teams plus your own self-performance. So one of the surprising things was that that it was your teammates, not your opponents, and that, you know, a good fifth of players report that it's their own performance that actually starts leading them to triggers the tilt response to them. When we look at the actual responses, again, we saw some really interesting patterns. You see that the top most frequent response to tilt is actually exiting the game. Now, unless it's a professional match, exiting the game is what coaches and GMs would recommend, right? Taking a break from the game when you start to make poor decisions because your emotions have been triggered, usually out of frustration. So exiting, we would classify as more on the positive side. So that's good. It's good to see the top category goes to something that's actually productive. Of course, the second one, again, is positive. So 25% reported that tilt responses of positive strategies like forcing yourself to smile, taking a really deep breath through your nose, breathing out your mouth, try to calm your body, getting up and stretching, you know, thinking of something funny or a joke, thinking of a friend. So those are positive strategies. Third, of course, were the negative ones. And these include everything from, you know, toxic speech and even hate speech online, all the way over to slamming your mouse, you know, punching your computer screen, yelling, screaming, etc. This 18% that we call lump, it's actually, lump is kind of a term from business, which I think of it in terms of like, you know, sort of taking your lump. So the idea is that you just do nothing. You're frustrated, you feel awful, but you just sort of put up with it. I mean, like you might in a business scenario where you're frustrated, but you can't afford to actually say much or do much about it. And then 3% said they never tilted ever, which is interesting, very small percentage. When we asked about tilt malleability, how easily do you think that you can change how tiltable you are? 67%, so 2/3 said yes, they think that it's malleable, which is, I think, is productive. And I'll show you in a minute why I think that's productive. Only 12% said no, it's not changeable. So those numbers look good. 21% said they weren't sure. So let's get into our hypotheses. So if you remember, there were two hypotheses. One, that what triggers you, you know, what the tilt trigger is may lead to different tilt responses. And the second, that beliefs about malleability may matter in terms of what your responses are. So for each of these, we tested them using a lambda, which is a measure of association that's appropriate for nominal variables. So for category data, like what we have here. And when you look at lambdas, anything less than a 0.1 is considered weak. 0.1 to 0.3 is considered moderate. Anything over 0.3 is considered a strong association. I should also say that lambdas are always positive. They don't have a direction, they just have a magnitude. So it's only 0 to 1. So when we look at both of our hypotheses, it turns out that yes, both hypotheses turn out to be true. They are strong associations and they're statistically significant. Here you can see like a 0.00 level. So let's take a look at the first one. Indeed, yes, different types of triggers elicit different types of responses, which of course intuitively makes sense. So here's what you start to see. In the first category, game, right? The majority response when the game itself is what's triggering you is simply to exit the game. Horribly rational. When losing the game is your tilt trigger, it splits into negative responses, 41% of the more, well, negative, toxic, disruptive kinds of behaviors, and 35% exiting, which again, I would say is more or less positive. When itself, you see an even split between negative and exiting again. And when it's other people, and this is interesting, you start to see that people are attempting to use more positive strategies, more lumping, meaning just putting up with it and trying not to be reactive, or exiting the game. So very few negative responses. Of course, when those negative responses happen and people are what is the trigger, you can imagine that's where you may get some of the toxic behavior. But it's very interesting to see that people are at least reporting that they are trying to tamp down their negative responses when people are actually what the trigger happened to be. All right, so in sum, players' harshest responses are reserved for themselves, while their best efforts at containing their frustration are reserved for other people, right? So what you see is the highest negative number is when you yourself are what you're mad about, and when other people are what you're irritated about, people are trying to contain the frustration. So it would seem. On the second hypothesis, it turns out that yes, beliefs about tilt's malleability do determine how one responds to it. So here you see that when someone believes that tilt is changeable, you see more positive responses to tilt. When they think it's negative, you see this higher negative number here. So when people think tilt is not something they can change, then you see a lot more negative responses. And here you'll notice that this I don't know category, you see a whole kind of spread of mixed, right? Which makes sense. If you look at the other data, this fits a nice pattern where you see if people aren't sure about malleability, then it's kind of a little bit spread all over the place. In sum, perceiving tilt as malleable has this positive effect. So, leading players essentially to opt for more positive responses when they think that tilt is malleable. So along the lines of Dweck's work, if that's sort of our metaphor that we're using, believing that tilt is something that you could control, or that your own sort of reactivity is something that you can have a say over or you can change, actually leads to these more positive responses rather than the straight up negative one. All right. We also then looked at relationships among all three variables. And, again, this study is really exploratory, especially since we had to stop sampling midway through because of the pandemic. But I just want to give you a sense of like some of the patterns that we're seeing in the data that I think are really worth further exploration. So what we did in order to look at the relationship between all three variables, so tilt trigger, tilt response, and perception of malleability. One way that we test this is that we do what's called partial tables. That's what we have here in front of us. So what you're essentially doing is you're looking at the relationship between tilt trigger, this one, and tilt response. So here's your independent variable and your dependent variable. You're looking at that relationship under holding constant this third variable. So you sort of, they call them partial tables because this is saying, let's just look at the kids who said tilt is malleable and see how this relationship holds. And it gives you a sense of how are these relationships, what is the relationship between all three of them? All right. So when players believe that tilt is malleable, what you see is that players actually end up all of their tilt responses shift toward positive. So indeed, we're seeing that the belief of malleability actually has this positive effect on, regardless of your trigger, how you're responding to it. So that's good. This is confirming evidence of the pattern we saw previously. Again, here where tilt is fixed among that population, tilt trigger to tilt response, what you see is suddenly this jump of negative responses. But what's also really interesting here is that, believe it or not, I want you to look right here. I'm gonna kind of ignore the people that say I don't know. I'm just gonna leave those out. If you look right here at self, you start to see something that's a little bit concerning and curious. Essentially, what you're seeing here is that regardless of whether an individual believes that tilt is malleable or tilt is fixed, their reactivity to their own play when they blame themselves or they're frustrated with themselves, it doesn't seem to make any difference at all. So, what I'm trying to say is that when players are themselves the trigger, their beliefs about malleability make no difference whatsoever. So, more productive beliefs about malleability of tilt do not protect players from the likelihood of negative responses in terms of like negative reactivity, negative self-talk, etc. So I'm going to pause there and take some questions. Again, if you're interested in this work, stay tuned. We're hoping to do a series of follow-up studies around this. I'm going to get rid of my slides and bring back me so I can answer some questions.
We have 2 questions for you.
Wait, hold on.
Oh, hold on.
Okay, now you're live.
Are we live?
We're
Okay.
back.
All right, so we got 2 questions for
Oh,
you.
wait.
Maybe.
Cody.
Okay, now we're live with you.
All right, we have 2 questions for you. So the first question is, how are we differentiating tilt from salt? Is there a difference?
That's a great question. I haven't investigated salt whatsoever, so I can't say anything to that. But what a good study to run.
Yeah. Well, I guess along those lines, what are some of the games you're using for your studies? Have you found stronger results among certain games than others?
Not yet. And again, this is so exploratory. The 2 games that were being played that we pulled participants from are League of Legends and Overwatch. So 2 pretty different genres, but again, both in the sort of straight up classic esports category. But it's a really interesting question to think about: how would game mechanics contribute to offering different tilt triggers, tilt malleability, and tilt responses? I would probably hypothesize that you would see difference by genre. Certainly you see differences in terms of disruptive player behavior by genre and by specific title. So if you look at the ADL report that came out last year around disruptive player behavior, they show that different specific titles have different set points of toxicity among the community. So if we're right and trigger is one of the variables that is causing some of that toxicity, you would predict that you're going to see different levels of tiltability among players in the game, and probably different sources.
Yeah, totally.
So speaking of different sources and recovering from those sources, did your studies find any ways to reverse the tilt or manage the tilt?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not any of the research questions that we asked in this, right? So I can't speak to data there, but I can speak to some of the curricular design that we're doing. I mean, part of why we looked at this particular variable, especially now, I mean, we were gathering these data in this study we went to analyze right at COVID. And that was right when our players, there was it was a pretty bad 6 weeks. And NASEP was able to sort of step up and offer a lot of platforms and online free content for teams to be able to compete and collaborate together on games. So in terms of some of the curricular design, Connected Camps and a couple other organizations have actually started working with coaches to develop some wellness curriculum that's really about stress management. One of the things I would love to explore, but we haven't had a chance to do it yet, but I'm really, I've been studying sort of teenagers, especially in games. I really came to games because I'm interested in teenagers, right? And if you know the lives of teenagers, games are huge, and there's such a rich area for kids, for teens, I should say young adults. But I should also say that there is this stress epidemic in the US. And we now not only see it among high schoolers and middle schoolers, we now see it among elementary school kids. So one of the reasons I'm very interested in this issue around when you yourself are the trigger is that kids have a lot of pressure on them at school. And it is only getting more intense. And we're seeing more and more, like greater and greater indicators of stress among kids around performance. So the idea that kids are trash talking themselves because they're not doing well enough in the game is one place where I feel like we could really move the needle some, right? Not only help tamp down some of the toxic behaviors online, but also help players, I guess, do a lot more positive self-talk and get a little bit more resilient and a little bit less hard on themselves, right? Because like kind of terrorizing yourself not only leads to these really toxic outcomes for other players, but it's really a horrible thing for kids to be doing for themselves.
Yeah.
And my hunch is that the patterns we're seeing in kids are going to be very similar with adult players as well. I mean, these are 14 to 18-year-old players. So in the esports scene, they're not too far off of what professional player age is. But that form of sort of self-abuse is one where I feel like we got to get in there around games and sort of remember that. I mean, sometimes I lose my patience with my own crappy gameplay sometimes too, right? So I sympathize. But just in the bigger scheme of life, especially these days, trying to figure out ways to make us more resilient to being so harsh on ourselves feels like a really positive place to start, right? Especially when you can help kids see that being that hard on yourself only leads to more failure and only leads to your team falling apart. And that's where
Absolutely.
I think some interventions with coaches would really, really hopefully have big impact, I hope.
Absolutely. I think we could talk about this topic for another hour at least.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, we've run out of time. So, Constance, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, we have a whole bunch of questions that we couldn't even get to, but thank you so much. I
Thank
really
you so much
appreciate
for
it.
doing the research. Keep it up. That's,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
sweet.
Well, and you can always share my email out to people who have questions because I have so many questions. This study is just the first of many. So
Okay.
I'd love to see what other people think of it. Thanks for having me, and what a great event.
Yeah, if you're comfortable with us sharing the email, we can definitely do that.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Well, have a great evening. Thank you again for coming, and maybe we can get you out to Columbus in the future for another GDEX.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, there will come a day where we get to travel again.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again.
Take care.
Bye.